I was saying that I want to thank for the invitation. I want to congratulate you for organizing this event. And thanks to the attendance of all the participants, it has released lots of interest for the ESPON program. I want to thank the responsible heads of the Spanish authorities, a monitoring point, who have contributed to recover the interest and practice of conducting with this kind of programs, which have been working in Spain from 2004. My participation as a Spanish partner has been really fruitful, and we are really proud when we see that the initiative goes on and that the technicians continue working in such an important matter, such as sustainable development. Today is a sad day, unfortunately, as my colleagues have said, due to the situation in Europe with the invasion of Ukraine. Yesterday, we celebrated the anniversary of a very highlighted date on the European process. Democracy is difficult to maintain, even if we think that this is something that we already achieved and that it's warranted. And we need to pull our efforts to maintain it and to make our best to put an end to this process which has just started. Now I want to share some contents with you, some basic details that can maybe be discussed during the questions and answers section. Let's see what's the role of green infrastructure within spatial planning. The contents of my presentation are organized in 4 big groups, 4 big sections. First of all, an analysis of the relationship between the green infrastructure and the design of this new spatial planning with different considerations throughout the history and considering the geographical context. Nowadays, it's important to consider spatial factors in the purest definition of this word, but we have to vindicate spatial, peri-urban and urban considerations, and including them in the European planning. And we have to define the connection between the urban and rural areas, and this was one of the purposes that we still need to develop. Second question is how green infrastructures are part of what we could call a territorial heritage system. A third point will deal with the challenges for green infrastructure and its implementation within the urban spatial planning. This is one of the main questions. I don't know if this is what you were expecting from my intervention, but well, this will be completed with some final comments on the different reforms that have been implemented in the context of Spain within the context of growth and transformation in different areas. The idea here consists on this transversal character with the green infrastructure. The previous participants had a few minutes to insist in each of these dimensions, which affect in one way or another or have a different impact at different levels. Green infrastructure for a certain territory such as the European, in which urban territories are as scarce because 30% of the population are located in urban areas. But from the territorial point of view, rural areas take 80% of the territory. So we have to consider this the distribution. Green infrastructure can be seen as a transversal tool for the spatial planning with a vision that I understand as president of Fondiclot and someone who has worked in this matter. We know how difficult it is to find a common way of understanding it and how to make spatial planning operational together with other urban policies and other territorial policies. I understand that this spatial planning can benefit from a wider vision which can be more comprehensive, such as green infrastructure. It entails a special planning with different pillars. I've reflected 3 of them: economic development, which has been at the service of most of the most developed countries. Then we have well-being as a second pillar with its environmental component. And third of it, and such as many researchers have written, the quality of life for people and for the different areas, no matter where these citizens live. I understand that there are initiatives in which we have given the necessary importance to the quality of life, which is really important within the context of the ESPON program. And this was reflected in one of the conferences of the European Union. And we have to focus on the preconditions that helps to take into account all the elements that contribute to the final purpose of improving the quality of life. And how can we understand green infrastructure within the territorial heritage system? Within the Spanish context and also within the European context, and in this point I share my point of view with other researchers, not only in other geographical context, but also in other areas such as environmental, ecological. Green infrastructure has been highly transformed at the European level. As Gemma and Jaume mentioned in some of their slides, green infrastructure, especially in urban spaces in Spain, is getting shrinked. It's a territory which is becoming more and more transformed and reduced. In this situation, considering my point of view, we need to take into account the way the heritage system works. We have to define the key connections for the way this system works, and also for the conservation of biodiversity, which is a principle which is widely known and recognized. And it's a political objective. It's a policy itself, and also an activity that can receive funds and financing. These are concepts that needs to be understood, related, and from that point we need to take decisions. This means that we need to put green infrastructure within our priorities and consider them as a territorial matter and not as the planning of open spaces, which is how we've been considering it. We need to give it the importance it has. Sometimes it is associated to protected spaces, especially in low population territories, which are far from the coast, which are far from urban metropolitan spaces, such as we saw in the case of Valencia, yeah, and such as Gemma mentioned. And this has to be reflected in the inside part of the territory. This is part of the innovation. We need to consider the territory differently. We have to consider its systemic character, and we have to take into account that cities have acquired their functionality as an ecological service within the city. We need to transform the old models of urbanization, taking into account risk, the climate change, fossilization, or sealed, the soil sealed due to heat, and associate them to the challenges provided by the pandemics, by the COVID. And we need to take into account a new perspective of urban sustainability within the Sustainable Development Objectives, the 11.7 on the right of cities to provide the citizens with areas and services no further than 15 or 30 minutes from their living point. Also, from the point of view of urbanism and architecture, we have so different academies appearing and promoting processes in which the vision of the city is a vision of a place where we live in, a common space where we can develop a community life and where the population can use these spaces. The idea is to give these spaces and provide these spaces with a quality character. These are some of the strategies of development taking into account a theoretical point of view of ecological functionalism. And this is linked to this new initiative that appeared from the commission, the presidents of the commission, and which is associated to the recovery plan. And the plan that has been presented by my colleague before. This is providing a new way of seeing the spatial planning, spatial and urban planning, far from the old way of considering it. We are integrating a more intelligent and comprehensive vision, a more sustainable model of spatial planning. In order to achieve this, green infrastructure has to face different challenges, and we will need to deal with each of the challenges progressively while we develop the urban planning. The vision goes farther than the nature elements. So our colleagues have shown a list of natural elements, but we need to refer to connectors and breaking points and use green infrastructure as a point of entrance and a link between urban and rural areas. The orchards in Valencia are good examples, but we can have other examples that can be a good model on how we can give a transition and we can consider these transitional areas which have been sometimes very much excluded. There is no planning between urban planning and environmental planning. So we need to go to look at the future considering the natural resources for protected spaces and considering these transitional areas, which have an economical influence and consider them with a similar criteria as a biosphere. And we need to consider also which is the utility of green infrastructure. We've talked a lot about multifunctionality. One of these slides of the Greta project showed some columns which were blank, and they will refer to economy and to social factors. So it needs a good review to reach this comprehensive character, which has also been mentioned by the colleague who presented before me. We need these ecosystem services, such as provisioning services, regulating services, and cultural services. From the point of view of multifunctionality, we need to take into account the economic and social impact. And it's important not to forget the regulating facts. How can they impact on control of floods and other natural phenomena? Also, we need to identify clearly where these factors are found, and that's why it's important to have a map that allows measuring and quantifying the benefits in the present and in the future of the green infrastructure. And we need to consider whether they need to be binding or not. This means whether we need to implement restrictions of the use of these natural and cultural resources, or if they shouldn't be restricted. We need to consider the legal basis to decide on this. And therefore, we need instruments, and some of them have already been defined. They are not binding, they are strategies, and they are aimed to provide advice. We have one at a Spanish level in which, with a certain delay, the national strategy on green infrastructure was approved. And these kind of instruments are a good resource. They are appropriate and they can contribute to a better governance. This has been used for the definition of this kind of elements at the state level, and they have to be developed at a regional level, and they have a delay until 2022 to do that. It's a good opportunity to link the laws on protected spaces, which are a competence of the regional authorities, to define the protection instruments, so that they are not isolated instruments. This happens with the areas protected by certain plans, certain official plans. And this way we can give them the coherence they need. And the local authorities who are not obliged to develop this green infrastructure, even if some of the municipalities have already done it, will be given competencies to define which are the areas that are interested to be protected. We could define the areas which are out of the official planning and that need a policy which provides protection. These have lots of implications and risks from the theoretical point of view. We need to focus on this approach, this process, and consider this development, which cannot be easy. We need to find a way to define and understand this process, and this transversal vision that has been mentioned by my colleagues before is not so much implemented. We still need to make lots of progress on this. In some rural areas, it may happen, but we have no rural agenda. We don't have funds for rural initiatives as we have for the urban agenda. And that's the reason why some of these new energies and new ways of taking advantage of the nature spaces can develop into undesirable situations. We need to consider the different ways of using the resources we have in these lands. I wanted to say that in these areas, strategies need to be indicative. This means that they need to adjust to each of the territories, to each of the areas, combining the ecological services and the different development options that can be implemented. Finally, and this is my last slide, the first very simple idea is that green infrastructure is also the gateway for urban green infrastructure. And it can be used, or it should take into account the previous plans, experiences, and initiatives that have already been implemented. I've talked about the Natura 2000 network, the cultural landscape, the touristic plans, the areas of high agronomic value, and all the different plans that have been developed at different levels, taking into account the different elements of territories at a regional or local level from the point of view of the spatial planning and the rural development, the tourist development plans, to start linking all these areas with this process of binding protection, or not that binding. And I want to close up by saying that the challenges of linking rural and urban areas and these changes demand a planning and a strategy of what we want to implement. The disappearance of the law on soil of 2015 demands a way of reconsidering spatial planning. We need a planning on the use of the soil and defining the main instrument, reducing the conflict between speculation and the fight, and the reclassification of those resources. And it opens the possibility of a new way of planning, more strategical with regard to the spatial model we had, including green infrastructure, and focus on the projects that are currently being applied, and considering the needs of these areas. And these projects will better use the knowledge and the experience within the land, and that will be integrated on a coherent strategy. Thanks a lot.